For this part, we're going to go over the Xenyx 502 mixer from Behringer. This is essentially a small format analog mixer. Now I prefer the analog mixers to the digital ones, as it's just kind of like the old school mixers. And when you start to go to the digital ones, you start to lose some of the character of the whole idea of being able to actually have the things change as a normal potentiometer would, because most of the potentiometers don't have an even sweep when you change the settings. And that's the same thing with these dials as we change them. But to get a basic idea of how I have it set, pretty much the gain and the volume on the microphone is pretty much set to 3 o'clock, and I pretty much sets the pan's pretty much set at 12 o'clock because this is a mono signal anyway, and we're pretty much setting it at about it looks like about 1 to 2 o'clock for the bass and the treble, as it's only a 2-band EQ, and that pretty much gives me a good overall signal for producing these videos. Now I might adjust it if I were to produce something different, but it seems like this works pretty well for producing something like this. And it seems that I get a pretty good output from this, and it doesn't seem to want to clip from producing any types of sound like this for my podcast or any type of vocal signal, as opposed to doing any other types of recording. Now, obviously, if I was singing or doing something or recording the audio from an amplifier, I'd probably set the settings differently to ensure that it doesn't clip. But as of right now, it doesn't clip, and we're doing great. And it took me a few days to figure out the exact settings, as it was a little bit differently because I hadn't had the experience with mixers. But once I got the feel of it, I ended up getting a good overall liking for it. But overall with it is I like the analog with it. If I went to a digital, it just wasn't going to be the same, because when you start to do it with it, it's more like you're dealing with equalizer sliders than anything else. And while equalizer sliders have their place, it's still different than when you have the potentiometer dials that can actually kind of adjust. And it's a little differently with it than dealing with the actual adjustment of the actual of an actual slider than an actual potentiometer. They kind of have a whole different feel to them and how they react. One's going to give you the slider's going to give you a very, very exact thing at each point, whereas the potentiometer is going to have an actual curvature to the actual change as you start to move up and up the dial, which is not going to give an even change as you start to move, which is a little bit interesting for usage of different devices. It doesn't matter if we're talking the linear taper or the logarithmic taper for the potentiometers. basically both are going to react the same way. And those, if you're looking at from the idea of music instruments, those are the same things. As it doesn't matter if you look at it from the aspect of the types of potentiometers on either volume potentiometers or tone potentiometers. It really doesn't matter. Both are going to react the same way. But what happens when you go with the actual sliders, these react the way an actual graphic equalizer on either a pedal or an actual rack mount will work. And this changes the exact way it works. And this is a little bit different because it keeps it kind of like in that old school method that you can kind of get that feeling for that kind of curvature and find exactly where in that curve it works best. And this is kind of within that system where you can find where it works best and find something that works for vocals, or if you're doing something else, find something that works for that either. And this is something that being we have an interface with this, we can use it for vocals or anything, any type of instrument that has an electric plug-in. Even if it doesn't have an electric plug-in, it can be mic'd up and actually adjusted that way as well, which is very, very nice. And when it comes down to the value of it, I mean, you're talking, it might not cost much. It might look actually very, very small. I mean, if you look at it compared to like the size of some large stomp boxes, there are some large stomp boxes like some of the old vintage Electro-Harmonix Big Muff Pies that are about the same size, and yet if you look at the size of it, it's about the same size, and yet you can get enough to have most things for a small format for what you need from what you need for like a small little gig. You wouldn't need much more. I mean, you get plenty of inputs. I mean, if you're talking from the aspect of inputs, you're talking, I believe it's 6 inputs that include, those are stereo. That's actually 5 inputs, being stereo being the first main input, and then you have 4 inputs that can be split or in stereo, depending on how you run them. And then you have the first main one, which is technically a stereo because it's a mic input, but it doesn't necessarily have to be viewed in stereo. You can actually split it out into 2 different inputs. So you have 5 separate inputs, and then you have so you can essentially do 5 inputs. That would be plenty for any type of thing, 4 of which would be mono, or you could essentially do 3 if you want to do stereo inputs, and that's plenty for any type of option for small recording. I mean, unless you're doing something like drums or something like that, then if you're doing like drums or something of that sort, I would recommend a much larger format mixer. But if you're not doing drums, if you're just doing basically stringed instruments and vocals, you probably wouldn't need it. You would probably be best off with just using something like a small format mixer like this. And then you could probably just actually record drums if you wanted to, actually at a later date or actually at a previous date, record drums actually with a unit like this. Might use all the mic options, and then use the other ones of an XLR to a 1/4 inch, and actually you can use that to mic it all up, and then you can record that track down, and then record the other tracks on like something like anything from like free from Audacity to any other types of thing like a Pro Tools and get the same outcome. So using something like this could easily work for any type of band for recording, which is very, very nice. To even just as simple as a podcast like this is. So it could be used for anything from like the studio work for separating out the drums and then doing doing at a later date the string instrument recordings to actually doing an actual podcast to a mix of whatever you want to do, which makes it real nice, and it basically fits virtually anywhere. I mean, it'll fit into a gig bag, it'll fit basically in like a side of a laptop carrying case, so it can basically fit virtually anywhere. And all you need is just the cables and whatever equipment, the cables, the interface, and whatever inputs you want to put into it. You just have to note that you're going to need the cables for the interface and then whatever cables are going to be plugging into it. That's the only thing you need to worry about. Now, after this, we're going to be getting into the interface. And obviously, I'm going to skip over the cables because that's kind of pointless, because that's all up to you beyond the RCA cables you're going to need for the interface. But everything else is beyond, is kind of up to the individual when it comes to that. But we'll get to the, right after this, we'll get to the interface, and I'll show you what I'm using for the interface. Okay, bye.